In the hush of a fading spring morning in 1937, a single man stood at the edge of a wind-swept runway, the echo of engines still whispering in the cold air, and history, unaware of his name, was quietly letting him go. Claire Lee Chennault, once celebrated as a daring tactician and visionary pilot, now found himself branded as a relic of the past, dismissed by the very institution he had served with relentless devotion. Yet it was in that moment of isolation, stripped of command and title, that the story of his rise truly began, because the journey of a hero does not start with applause, but with rejection, and in Chennault's case, rejection came wrapped in polished military decorum and official letters of retirement, stamped by men who believed the future of war belonged not to the agile fighter, but to the invincible bomber. For years he had challenged that sacred doctrine, standing before skeptical generals chalk in hand, sketching loops, turns, and formations that defied convention, arguing that speed, maneuver, and coordination could outwit brute force. But the room always went cold when he spoke. His ideas, though brilliant, were too dangerous for bureaucratic minds. Still, he believed deeply that in the chaos of the skies, the smallest plane, if flown with courage and strategy, could bring down giants. And for that belief, he was quietly shown the door, leaving behind the hangars, the smell of oil and smoke, the dream of transforming air combat. He walked into a world that no longer wanted him, a world on the edge of war, a world where clouds of conflict gathered over Asia. Yet destiny, patient and unseen, was not done with him. For across the Pacific, in the rising tension between China and Japan, an opportunity was forming, a call to adventure disguised as exile. He journeyed east, a retired American officer stepping into a nation desperate for hope. And there, among worn airfields and broken biplanes, he began again, not as a soldier of a great army, but as a mentor to the outnumbered and under-equipped, teaching young Chinese pilots how to think like hunters, not prey. He spoke of timing, of surprise, of discipline in the skies, crafting tactics that could turn weakness into advantage. And though few believed at first, they listened, because his conviction was unshakable. Each dawn, as the rising sun cast its light over Yunnan's misty mountains, Chennault would watch his pupils take to the air, their planes trembling but their spirits burning, and he would whisper to himself that someday the world would see what fighters could do. The years that followed were hard. Illness, exhaustion, and doubt pressed upon him, but in the crucible of struggle, his vision hardened into steel, and when war finally engulfed the Pacific, it found in Chennault a man ready, forged by failure and belief to prove the impossible true. And so when the United States, reeling from Pearl Harbor, turned once more to the man they had once cast aside, he answered without hesitation, returning not for rank or recognition, but for purpose. Under his guidance, a band of volunteers, pilots, mechanics, dreamers, would form the legendary Flying Tigers, a force that would carve its name across the sky with the roar of their engines and the teeth painted on their P-40 fighters, symbols of defiance and courage. As the battles raged over China's skies, Chennault's unorthodox tactics, hit-and-run strikes, tight formations, coordinated dives, shattered the myth of Japanese air supremacy, proving once and for all that the fighter, in the hands of a disciplined few, could dominate the heavens. Every victory carried the echo of vindication, every downed bomber a silent apology from those who once doubted him. And as the world watched the Tigers fight with unmatched ferocity, Chennault's vision finally stood vindicated in smoke and sunlight. Yet beneath the triumph lay exhaustion, the burden of leadership, the ache of years lost to disbelief. And though he smiled as his men returned from missions, part of him always remembered that lonely runway in 1937. The moment his story had begun, not with glory but with dismissal. Now the same voice that once called him obsolete was calling him a genius. The same institutions that cast him aside now sought his counsel. But for Chennault, the true victory was not in medals or headlines. It was in the quiet knowing that he had been right to believe. That conviction, when rooted in truth, could outlast ridicule. And as the war drew toward its end, he watched new generations of pilots soar under doctrines born from his ideas. And in their triumphs he found peace. History would later call him many names: visionary, rebel, patriot. But he remained to the end the man who looked to the sky and saw not limits, but possibilities. The man who proved that courage is not in following orders, but in standing alone when the world says you're wrong. And so, When we remember Claire Lee Chennault, we remember not just the commander of the Flying Tigers, but the spirit of a dreamer who refused to bow to certainty, whose story reminds us that the future belongs not to those who obey the old rules, but to those bold enough to write new ones in the sky itself. And yet, even as the world began to whisper his name in admiration, Chennault knew that triumph was never a resting place but merely another battlefield in disguise, for the fight above the clouds was only half of his war. Below, in dimly lit command huts scattered across the Chinese countryside, he wrestled with the impossible mathematics of survival. Too few planes, too little fuel, too many enemies closing in from every direction, and still he refused despair, sketching new tactics across maps stained with coffee and dust, his voice steady as he told his men that victory was a matter of discipline and imagination, not numbers, that the air belonged to those who understood it like a living thing. His pilots, some barely older than boys, listened to every word, drawn not to rank but to belief. And when the sirens howled and the distant hum of Japanese bombers rolled like thunder through the valleys, they would climb into their shark-toothed P-40s and rise, not as soldiers chasing glory, but as students chasing the proof of their teacher's faith. Chennault would stand below, binoculars fixed to the horizon, watching specks turn into streaks of fire. Each maneuver, each daring dive a testament to the art he had forged in exile. Often the radios crackled with chaos, voices breaking, engines sputtering. But within that storm of noise he heard the rhythm of understanding, his rhythm, the fighters moving as one, outthinking, outturning, outfighting machines that had once seemed invincible. Reports from the front poured in, and with them, disbelief from military headquarters thousands of miles away. How could a ragtag volunteer group hold off the Empire's best? And Chennault, weary yet vindicated, would smile faintly, knowing that genius is often mistaken for luck by those who never dared to try. The Flying Tigers became legend long before the official war caught up with them, their kill ratios defying arithmetic, their courage defying gravity itself. And through the smoke of every dogfight, through the endless noise of machine gun fire and wind, Chennault's conviction spoke louder than any engine, that discipline of mind and heart could turn even the smallest force into a storm. Still, the victories came at a cost, as they always do. Pilots lost to fire and altitude, friends buried in foreign soil, and in the quiet hours between missions, he would walk alone among the wrecks, touching the torn metal of fallen planes, whispering to the ghosts of his students that their sacrifice was not in vain, that the world was learning, slowly, painfully, what he had always known. Back in Washington, however, his ideas still met resistance. Bureaucrats arguing over numbers and supply chains, generals unwilling to admit that the mad major had been right all along. But history is patient, and Chennault had learned to let results speak louder than memos. By the time America entered the full tide of war, his theories had become practice, his doctrines folded quietly into official manuals, and young pilots he had never met now flew under skies shaped by his imagination. He watched them from afar, proud yet distant, a craftsman watching others wield his tools, and though age and illness gnawed at him, his eyes still burned with that same defiant spark. When the war finally tilted toward victory, the press came calling, eager to crown him a hero, to turn the stubborn rebel into a patriotic symbol. But Chennault would only shake his head. Heroes, he said softly, were the men who never came back, the ones whose names faded beneath the roar of engines. As peace settled uneasily over the world, he returned once more to the quiet, to the long view of history he had always carried, knowing that truth rarely arrives in parades but in echoes. And so the years passed, his health declining, his legend growing, until at last he could look back across the decades and see the line his life had drawn, from the lonely runway of dismissal to the crowded skies of vindication, a single arc of faith cutting through time. And perhaps that is the true essence of his story, that every visionary must walk through exile before the world can see what he saw all along, that conviction tested by isolation becomes wisdom, and wisdom shared in courage becomes legacy. Even now, when jet engines roar where propellers once hummed, when digital radars trace the sky instead of human eyes, the principles he carved into the wind endure. Agility over arrogance, coordination over chaos, spirit over statistics. A reminder that the sky, for all its distance, still bends to the will of those who dare to understand it. And somewhere in the memory of the clouds, you can almost hear his voice carried by the slipstream, calm, unwavering, still teaching. Trust the fighter. Trust the pilot, trust the mind that refuses to yield. And with those words, his story lingers, not as a chapter closed, but as an eternal ascent toward the horizon he never stopped chasing. And so, as the guns of war fell silent and the smoke that had once blackened the skies began to drift away into the stillness of peace, Claire Lee Chennault found himself standing once again at the edge of an airfield, not as the outcast he had once been, nor as the commander of a daring volunteer squadron, but as a man at peace with the sky itself. The wind that brushed against his face was gentler now, the roar of engines replaced by the quiet hum of memory. Yet within that silence lived every scream of battle, every flash of tracer fire, every heartbeat of courage that had defined his life. He had seen the impossible become truth, had watched the world rewrite its doctrines to match the vision he once defended alone, and in that vindication there was both triumph and melancholy. For the cost of being right had been measured in years of loneliness and the lives of men he could never forget. Still, he carried himself with the same steel-spined grace, his body failing but his eyes still fixed on horizons others could not see. Traveling once more across the Pacific to advise, to build, to teach, determined that the lessons paid for in fire would not fade with peace. He spoke to young officers who had grown up under jet trails instead of propellers, warning them that technology might change but human nature never would. That courage, instinct, and imagination would always be the true engines of flight. They listened respectfully, though few truly grasped that the man before them had once redrawn the map of air warfare with nothing but conviction and chalk dust. His health began to falter, the old lung ailments returning, the years of stress and fatigue finally demanding their price. Yet he refused rest, writing reports, advising new commands, shaping the future of aviation policy, even as the doctors urged him to slow down. When at last he did lay his pen aside, it was not in surrender but in quiet fulfillment, knowing that the fire he had carried had spread beyond him, into classrooms, squadrons, manuals, and minds across the world. On July 27, 1958, the voice that had once defied an entire military doctrine fell silent. But the silence it left behind was not emptiness, it was echo. Echo that still rolls through every sky where fighters fly in disciplined unity, through every mind that dares to question orthodoxy, through every dreamer who refuses to believe that it can't be done. For Chennault's story was never simply about planes and tactics. It was about the soul of innovation itself, about the courage to think differently when conformity feels safe, to hold a vision so fiercely that even exile cannot erase it. In every age there are new mad majors, dismissed, doubted, told their time is over, and in every age the world eventually realizes that progress has always depended on their stubbornness. So when historians speak his name, they speak of more than a man. They speak of the moment when one voice changed the wind, when one discarded pilot taught the world that conviction can outfly authority. And perhaps somewhere, high above the contrails of the modern world, there is still a phantom formation cutting through the clouds, the ghostly shapes of shark-toothed fighters guarding the endless blue, led by a figure whose gaze never wavered. The sound of their engines is faint now, lost beneath the thunder of new machines. But if you listen closely, really listen, you can still hear it. The rhythm of belief, the heartbeat of a rebel who proved that the sky has room for those who dare. And as the last line of his story fades into the horizon, one truth remains clear, that greatness is not granted by rank or title, nor measured by the approval of peers, but born from the quiet defiance of a single mind willing to dream beyond limits. Claire Lee Chennault's life reminds us that every breakthrough begins as a heresy, every revolution as a whisper, and that sometimes the world must first call you mad before it can call you right. So let his legacy stand as a beacon to all who look upward, a reminder that the sky, vast and indifferent, still belongs to those who believe that no height is unreachable, no doctrine unchangeable, no dream too bold to chase.